I mean, look around. What do you see, John? Huh? You see divorced, separated, even widowed chicks?
Yeah.
They look around, what do they see? They see you, and they see me, my friend.
What if the show you thought was a cozy NBC sitcom about divorce was secretly built on a BBC backlot fire, inspired a Breaking Bad casting thread, and launched the same week as a totally different show about a man losing his wife? Buckle up. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Dear John. Fact 1. The only fool's connection nobody talks about.
By the time your wedding rolls around, you and I could be back to being total strangers.
You're right. So which do you prefer, the chicken or the veal?
Chicken or the pork?
Most people who watched Dear John on NBC in the late 1980s had no idea they were watching something built on the work of one of Britain's greatest comedy writers. The show was actually based on a British sitcom of the same name that aired on the BBC from 1986 to 1987. And that original series was created by a man named John Sullivan. If the name John Sullivan doesn't immediately ring a bell for American audiences, it almost certainly would for anyone who grew up watching British television. Sullivan was the writer behind Only Fools and Horses, a sitcom about two working-class brothers in London trying to get rich through small-time dealing and bad ideas. Only Fools and Horses ran for over 2 decades and is consistently ranked as one of the greatest British sitcoms ever made. It remains enormously popular in the United Kingdom to this day and still attracts huge viewing audiences whenever it is repeated on television. Sullivan was known for writing characters who were lovable but deeply flawed, people who kept failing but never quite gave up, and he brought exactly that sensibility to the original Dear John. The show followed a man named John Lacey, whose wife leaves him, forcing him to join a divorce support group, where he meets a collection of people, all struggling with similar heartbreak in very different ways. That setup, ordinary people sitting in a circle, trying to figure out their lives, came entirely from Sullivan's imagination. When NBC decided to adapt the format for American audiences, they kept the core structure and the emotional tone almost entirely intact. What they imported, without always advertising it, was the blueprint of a writer who had already proven he understood how to make audiences laugh at sadness and root for people who kept getting things wrong. Fact 2. The time slot nightmare.
All right, fantastic! Oh, this is great! Am I a lucky guy or what?
So what did she say?
She said she'd think about it.
One of the quieter and more remarkable things about Dear John is simply that it lasted as long as it did, because NBC did almost everything in its power to make that difficult. Over the course of its 4 seasons on the air, the network moved the show's time slot an extraordinary number of times, shuffling it across different nights and different hours in a way that made it genuinely hard for casual viewers to keep track of where it had ended up each week. This kind of scheduling instability is usually a sign that a network has lost confidence in a show and is running out of ideas about where to put it. When a program keeps getting moved, it tends to lose viewers simply because people can't find it, and advertisers start to get nervous about putting money behind something that feels unsettled. By most conventional logic, a show that gets bounced around that aggressively should not survive 4 seasons. The fact that Dear John managed to hold on to an audience through all of that movement says something real about the loyalty of the people who genuinely liked it. Fans had to actively seek the show out rather than simply turning on the television at a familiar time and knowing it would be there. That kind of dedicated viewership is harder to build and harder to keep, and yet the show kept going. Part of what helped was that NBC was pairing it with stronger shows during certain periods, which gave it a degree of protection. But even with that, surviving repeated time slot changes across 4 seasons is genuinely unusual for a sitcom that was never considered a prestige property or a flagship hit. It quietly outlasted a lot of shows that had far more stable homes on the schedule. Fact 3. The Cleveland Little Emmy twist.
So how you been?
Seems like ages since we've visited.
I've been fine.
Good. Fine is good.
In its first season, Dear John did something that a lot of people weren't expecting from a light Thursday night sitcom on NBC. In an episode called Stand By Your Man, which was the 13th episode of that opening season, the show brought in a guest actor named Cleveland Little to play a man who had just seen his own marriage fall apart. The twist was that his character was a gay man who had been married to a woman, and the episode explored what it meant for him to finally stop hiding that part of himself. Cleveland Little was already well known to American audiences by that point. He had become a beloved figure in Hollywood largely because of his lead role in Blazing Saddles, Mel Brooks's 1974 Western comedy, in which he played Sheriff Bart with a combination of wit and effortless cool that made him genuinely iconic. He had also worked extensively in theater and had won a Tony Award on Broadway before his film career took off. By the time he appeared on Dear John in 1988, he was a respected and experienced performer. What made his guest appearance particularly notable was what happened after the episode aired. The Television Academy recognized his performance with a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Guest Actor in a Comedy Series in 1989. That was only the second year the guest actor category had even existed as a formal Emmy category, which meant Little was among the very first performers to ever win in that role. For a sitcom about a divorce support group to earn that kind of recognition through a storyline about a closeted gay man finding his footing after a difficult marriage in 1988 was genuinely ahead of where most mainstream television was at the time. Fact 4. Built on the ashes of a backlot fire.
What are you getting at?
What am I getting at? Read between the lines.
Television shows film in a lot of different places, and viewers rarely give much thought to the physical locations where sets are built, or what might have stood there before. In the case of Dear John, there is a genuinely strange piece of history underneath the fictional Rego Park Community Center, where John Lacey's divorce support group held its weekly meetings. The exterior facade of that community center was constructed on the Paramount Pictures backlot in Hollywood, which sounds perfectly ordinary until you understand what had happened to that backlot just a few years earlier. In 1983, a major fire swept through a large section of Paramount's outdoor backlot and destroyed most of the facades and exterior sets that had been built up over decades of filmmaking. Backlot fires of that scale were genuinely devastating to studios because those exterior structures were expensive to build, took years to develop, and served as the backdrop for an enormous range of productions. When Paramount began rebuilding its outdoor backlot after the fire, the exterior facade used for Dear John was among the first new constructions to go up on the cleared land. That means the community center where John and his group talked about their failed marriages and complicated lives was quite literally one of the first new things standing on ground that had recently been cleared by fire. Most of the cast and crew would never have thought twice about where they were filming or what had come before them on that spot. From a practical standpoint, a facade is just a facade. But there is something quietly odd about a show built entirely around people picking up the pieces of their lives being filmed on a piece of land that had itself needed to be rebuilt from scratch after a disaster. Fact 5. 8 episodes that vanished.
You finally asked her out.
No. We both pulled the graveyard shift.
When a television series gets canceled, what usually happens is that the network stops airing new episodes and the show simply ends. But sometimes the cancellation comes in the middle of a production cycle, which means finished or nearly finished episodes already exist that never get broadcast. That is exactly what happened with Dear John when it came to an end after its 4th season. 8 episodes were produced as part of the show's run, but were never aired on NBC. These were not rough cuts or unfinished pilots. They were completed episodes that had gone through the full production process, with scripts, performances, editing, and everything else a finished episode requires. They simply never made it onto the broadcast schedule before the plug was pulled. Some of the unaired episodes had titles that suggested the show's writers were leaning into darker or more complicated storylines in that final stretch. Episodes with names like Poor John, Part 1 and Part 2, and another called The Nightmare Continues, pointed toward a continuation of John Lacey's story that most viewers never got to see. Whether those episodes would have changed how the show is remembered is impossible to say, but their existence raises an obvious question about what kind of ending the writers were building toward. For many years, these episodes existed only in the hands of collectors who had managed to obtain VHS recordings through unofficial channels. That small community of dedicated fans preserved footage that might otherwise have been lost entirely, which is not an unusual story when it comes to American television from the late 1980s and early 1990s, a period when home recording technology made it possible for ordinary viewers to save things that studios and networks weren't always careful to archive themselves. Fact 6. Kirk's Therapy Group Trilogy.
Well, there's only one way to find out, Ralphie. You ask her out, and you see if you wind up with a hickey or a spot on your lung.
Jerry Burns played Kirk Morris on Dear John, and Kirk was the kind of character you either found hilarious or slightly exhausting, depending on your tolerance for confident, self-absorbed men who think they understand women far better than they actually do. Burns played him with such committed energy that Kirk became one of the show's most memorable figures, and the performance helped establish Burns as a recognizable face in American television comedy. What is genuinely unusual is what came next in Burns's career, not once, but twice. In 2006, he appeared in a short-lived ABC sitcom called Help Me, Help You, in which he again played a character who was part of a therapy or mental health group. The setup was different, the tone was different, and the character was different. But the basic framework, a group of people in a room working through their problems together, was the same one Burns had inhabited on Dear John nearly 2 decades earlier. Then in 2008, Burns appeared in Breaking Bad, the AMC drama that would go on to become one of the most acclaimed American television series ever made. His role was relatively small but specifically memorable. He played the facilitator of a 12-step recovery group that Jesse Pinkman, one of the show's central characters, begins attending as his life spirals further out of control. Once again, Burns was in the room, part of a group, sitting in a circle, while people tried to figure out how to put themselves back together. 3 different shows spread across roughly 20 years of television history, and each one found a reason to put Jerry Burns in exactly the same kind of space. It is the kind of pattern that is either a remarkable coincidence or a sign that casting directors kept seeing something in him that fit that particular world. Fact 7. Renamed and shipped back to Britain.
Ralph, just sit down. Now listen, compose yourself, Ralph. We can't find your glasses.
Okay, that's it. John Light, I win. Hand over $40, Louise.
When an American television network adapts a British show, it is not unusual for the original British version to already be well known to domestic audiences in the United Kingdom. What is somewhat unusual is when the American remake then gets exported back to Britain and broadcast to the very audiences who watched the original. That is precisely what happened with Dear John. The NBC version of the show was eventually aired in the United Kingdom, but the network or distributor made one adjustment before putting it on television. They retitled it. In Britain, the show was broadcast as Dear John USA, a title that made it immediately clear to British viewers that what they were watching was an American version of something they had already seen done with their own actors, in their own country, for their own BBC. There is something inherently amusing about that situation. British audiences who had watched the original series, which starred Ralph Bates and was written by John Sullivan, were now being invited to watch American actors work their way through the same basic premise. The suffix USA was presumably added to avoid confusion between the two shows, since both carried the same name, but it also had the unintentional effect of making the American version sound almost like a foreign language remake, which, in a sense, it was. It is worth noting that this kind of transatlantic exchange happens in both directions in the television industry. British formats regularly become American hits, and American shows frequently find audiences in Britain. But the specific oddness of watching a remake of your own show, clearly labeled as coming from somewhere else, and knowing that the format originated in your own country, gives the Dear John USA situation a particular flavor that is hard to replicate. Fact 8. It launched alongside a suspiciously similar show.
Marriage, I just couldn't stop. What is it you're addicted to, Brooke? Sex?
Television networks have always competed with each other for viewers, and one of the more common strategies is to counter-program against a rival by offering something completely different to audiences on the same night. What is far less common is for two shows on the same network to launch in the same week with almost identical emotional premises. That, however, is exactly what NBC did in the fall of 1988. Dear John premiered on NBC and was quickly followed, just 2 days later, by a brand new sitcom called Empty Nest. Both shows centered on a middle-aged man whose domestic life had been upended by the absence of his wife. Both were set in environments built around a kind of loneliness that was meant to be played for warmth and comedy. Both were clearly aimed at a similar audience demographic, and both arrived on NBC's schedule within 48 hours of each other. Empty Nest starred Richard Mulligan as a widowed pediatrician in Florida whose adult daughters kept inserting themselves into his life, and it was actually a spin-off of The Golden Girls, which gave it a built-in audience from the start. It would go on to run for 7 seasons, significantly outlasting Dear John in terms of total episode count. The timing of the two launches was never fully explained in terms of network strategy, and it is genuinely unclear whether NBC saw the two shows as competing with each other or as complementary offerings for the same audience. What is clear is that in the span of a single week, the network effectively bet twice on the same emotional note, the lonely middle-aged man trying to navigate a life that had changed around him without his permission, and somehow got away with it for years. Fact 9. Woody Harrelson dropped by.
Surprised to hear from you. Was afraid you'd forgotten all about me.
No, and I have a feeling I never will.
By the time Dear John was airing on NBC in the late 1980s, the network had built a genuinely strong Thursday night lineup that included some of the most popular sitcoms on American television. That environment made it relatively easy to attract guest stars who were already working within the NBC system, since actors could move between productions on the same lot or within the same general scheduling family. One of the more notable names to pass through Dear John during its run was Woody Harrelson. At that point in his career, Harrelson was best known for playing Woody Boyd on Cheers, the long-running NBC bar sitcom that had been a cornerstone of the network's Thursday lineup since 1982. Woody Boyd was a lovably naive bartender from a small town in Indiana, and the character had made Harrelson a recognizable and well-liked presence in American living rooms over several seasons. His appearance on Dear John was the kind of crossover that felt natural for NBC during that period. The network had a stable of familiar faces who moved between its various productions, and bringing a recognizable Cheers actor onto another NBC sitcom was a straightforward way to generate goodwill with audiences who were already tuned into the network on the same night. In the years that followed, Harrelson's career would expand dramatically. He would go on to earn Academy Award nominations, star in prestige dramas and major film productions, and become one of the more versatile actors of his generation. But in the late 1980s, he was still primarily the gentle, funny bartender from Indiana, and his guest appearance on Dear John was very much of that moment, a snapshot of where both the actor and the network were at a very specific point in television history. Fact 10. Ralph's marriage lasted under 6 hours.
I thought Molly and I would get married in the Lincoln Tunnel and have a traditional toll collector's wedding.
Every character in the Dear John support group had a story that explained why they were there, and most of those stories involved the kind of slow, painful unraveling that tends to accompany the end of a long marriage or a serious relationship. Ralph Drang's backstory was something else entirely. Ralph, played by Jerry Burns's co-star Harry Groener, had been married to a Bulgarian woman, and the details of how that marriage ended were about as bleak and absurd as anything on the show. His wife had agreed to marry him, not out of love or attraction or any of the feelings people typically associate with wanting to spend a life with someone, but because she needed to avoid being deported. The marriage was a transaction, and Ralph was the means to an end. What made the situation even more remarkable was the timeline. Ralph's wife did not wait for weeks or months after the wedding to make her exit. She left him at the wedding reception itself, which means the entire arc of his marriage, from the ceremony to the abandonment, took place within a single day. Depending on how long the reception lasted before she walked out, it is quite possible that Ralph was a married man for fewer than 6 hours. He ended up in the support group as a result of this experience, sitting in a circle with people who had all lost something, nursing a hurt that was arguably more humiliating than most because of how quickly it had happened and how obviously transactional it had been from the start. The character worked largely because Groener played him with genuine pathos rather than just as a punchline, which gave Ralph's absurd backstory an emotional weight that kept him from becoming simply a joke. Fact 11. People magazine called Kirk the worst man on TV.
Love? What? Love. The broad was loaded!
Television critics and entertainment magazines have always had a complicated relationship with genuinely unlikable characters on popular sitcoms. There is a long history of characters who are selfish, obnoxious, or morally questionable becoming audience favorites precisely because of those qualities. And Kirk Morris on Dear John fits squarely into that tradition. Jerry Burns played Kirk as a man who was almost completely focused on pursuing women and presenting a version of himself that bore very little relationship to reality. He was vain, he was unreliable, and he had a quality of cheerful shamelessness that made it nearly impossible to take him seriously as a human being. He was not a villain exactly, he was too bumbling and too self-unaware for that, but he was also not someone you would want to spend much time around in real life. People magazine took notice of the character, and in a description that was clearly meant as a compliment, wrapped inside an insult, called Kirk Morris the biggest, funniest, sleaziest slimeball on primetime television. It was the kind of label that, in the context of a popular entertainment magazine writing about a network sitcom, functioned as a badge of honor rather than a genuine criticism. People were watching Dear John, at least in part, because Kirk was there to be outrageous. The show did crack the Nielsen Top 10 during parts of its run, and the magazine connected that success directly to Kirk's presence in the ensemble. There is a specific kind of alchemy that happens when a supporting character is awful enough to be entertaining without being awful enough to be genuinely off-putting. And Kirk seems to have landed right in that zone, the kind of character you love watching precisely because you would never want to be around him. Fact 12. 14 episodes versus 90. A wild expansion.
Halfway through the ceremony, a sheep gave birth.
Maybe next week you can show us the wedding pictures.
When American networks adapt British television formats, one of the most consistent challenges they face is volume. British television series tend to run for short, carefully constructed seasons, sometimes as few as 6 episodes, and the stories told within those seasons are often tight and purposeful. American network television, by contrast, runs on a model built around 20-plus episode seasons and multiple years of renewal, which means any format that gets transplanted across the Atlantic has to grow far beyond what it was originally designed to do. In the case of Dear John, the difference in scale was dramatic. The original British series, which aired on the BBC in 1986 and 1987, ran for a total of 14 episodes across its 2 seasons. That was the complete story as John Sullivan had conceived it, a focused, contained piece of television with a clear beginning, middle, and end. The American version ran for 90 episodes over 4 seasons. That is more than 6 times the total output of the original, which meant the writers working on the NBC adaptation had to generate an enormous amount of new material that Sullivan had never written and never intended to write. New character arcs had to be invented from scratch. Relationships had to be developed, complicated, and resolved. Major life events, pregnancies, new jobs, new relationships, moments of genuine change, had to be constructed to give the characters somewhere to go across nearly 100 episodes. Some of what was added worked well and contributed to the show's identity as its own distinct piece of television. Some of it was filler, as is almost inevitable when any series runs long enough. But the sheer difference in numbers between 14 episodes and 90 remains one of the more startling illustrations of how differently British and American television think about storytelling scale. Fact 13. The British star died while the American version still aired.
Hi, everyone. I just came from my lawyers.
Oh, what are we talking, John? A malpractice suit on the nose job?
The original British Dear John starred a man named Ralph Bates, who played the central character of John Lacey in both series of the BBC production. Bates was a well-regarded British actor who had worked extensively in film and television throughout the 1970s and 1980s, and he brought a particular kind of quiet sadness to the role of John that fit the show's tone of comedy mixed with genuine emotional weight. The British series wrapped up in 1987 after its 2 seasons, which was also around the time that American television was picking up the format and beginning to develop the NBC version with Judd Hirsch in the lead role. The 2 shows existed as separate productions, with separate casts and separate creative teams, but they shared a premise and a basic emotional DNA. What gives this particular fact its strange quality is the timeline. Bates was diagnosed with cancer and became seriously ill in the years following the end of the British series. He died in 1991, which meant that the American version of Dear John, built on the same premise he had helped bring to life, was still actively airing new episodes on NBC when he passed away. The show he had originated was still running, just in a different country and with a different actor, while the man who had played the character first was no longer alive. It is the kind of coincidence that nobody planned or intended, but it gives the history of the 2 shows a melancholy dimension that sits underneath the comedy. Bates never lived to see how the American version ended, and the American version kept going for 3 more years after he was gone. Fact 14. The theme song was written by the British creator. When television shows are adapted from one country to another, the creative elements that travel across tend to be structural: the basic premise, the character types, the general tone. What usually gets replaced are the more specific creative details: the music, the visual style, the particular jokes that only make sense in their original cultural context. Theme songs, in particular, are almost always rewritten or replaced entirely when a format moves between countries. Dear John did not entirely follow that pattern. The original British series had a theme written by John Sullivan, the same writer who created the show, and who was also responsible for the music on several of his other productions. Sullivan was not just a comedy writer. He had a genuine musical sensibility and was closely involved in the sonic identity of the shows he made. When the American adaptation was developed, the theme music carried over in a meaningful way from the British original. Sullivan's involvement in the musical DNA of the show meant that even as NBC was rebuilding the format for a new audience with new actors and new scripts, the melody that opened every episode had roots in what Sullivan had originally created. For viewers watching the NBC version, this would have meant nothing in particular. It was simply the theme song, familiar and unremarkable after a few weeks of regular viewing. But for anyone who knew the history of how the show had come to exist, there was something worth noting in the fact that Sullivan's creative fingerprints were still audible even in the American version. Every episode of the NBC Dear John opened with a piece of music that traced back directly to the Only Fools and Horses writer sitting down and thinking about what his show should sound like. Fact 15. A third British series was planned. Then One Foot in the Grave took its slot.
So, partner?
The original British Dear John ended after 2 series, and for a period it seemed like a third might actually happen. The show had been well received. John Sullivan was one of the BBC's most valued comedy writers, and there was no obvious creative reason why the story couldn't continue. A third series was reportedly in consideration for around 1990, which would have kept the British version running alongside the NBC adaptation that was already well into its own run by that point. It didn't happen. The third series never came together, and the reasons were a combination of scheduling, the demands on Sullivan's time, and the progression of Ralph Bates's illness, which made continuing the show with the same central cast increasingly complicated. Whatever the specific circumstances, the slot that might have gone to a third series of Dear John instead went to a brand new BBC sitcom. That sitcom was One Foot in the Grave, created by David Renwick and starring Richard Wilson as Victor Meldrew, a recently retired man whose fury at the absurdity and inconvenience of modern life became the engine of one of British television's most beloved comedy series. One Foot in the Grave ran for 6 series between 1990 and 2001, accumulated a massive and deeply loyal audience, and is widely considered one of the greatest British sitcoms ever produced. The connection between the 2 shows is not causal in any direct way. One did not cause the other to exist. But there is a genuine historical thread running between them. The space left by a Dear John that didn't happen was filled, at least in part, by a show that turned out to matter enormously to British comedy. One thing stepped back, and something remarkable stepped in.